Thanks. The first 3 talks this morning, I think, have been optimistic. We've heard about the promise of big data. We've heard about advances in emotions, and I think we've just heard from Fiery, who very cleverly managed to find a way to leave before I gave my remarks, about some really cool stuff about how we're understanding something very deep about human nature. And I think there's a risk that my remarks are going to be understood as pessimistic, but they're really not. And my optimism is embodied in the notion that what we're doing here is important and we can do it better. And I really wanted to take this opportunity to have a chance to speak to the people here about what's been going on in some corners of psychology, mostly in areas like social psychology and decision making. In fact, Danny Kahneman has chimed in on this discussion, which is really what some people have thought about as a crisis in certain parts of psychology, which is that insofar as replication is a hallmark of what science is about, there's not a lot of it, and what there is shows that things we thought were true maybe aren't. And that's really bad. And I think this is a great setting in which to talk about these things. And I want to talk about it in part from my experience in this, and because I started to come into contact with this in a way that I'll describe right now. So let me just give you a quotation. This is from Barack Obama, President of the United States. He says, "I'm trying to pare down decisions. I don't want to make decisions about what I'm eating or wearing." He was discussing the fact that all of his suits are the same, so he doesn't have to actually pick suits each day. He says, "You need to focus your decision-making energy." He's relying here on an idea from psychology, which is that there's this stuff called willpower, and this connects to Fiery's previous remarks, and you sort of use it up, and if you use up your reservoir of willpower, you've got less of it to make a decision. This is some work that was developed by Roy Baumeister and colleagues more than a decade ago. The theory paper on which it's based has been cited over 1,500 times, which for the uninitiated in psychology, that's a lot. The modal number of citations of papers it tracks is 0, so 1,500 is bigger than that. And I remember coming across this and thinking, this is very contrary to the kind of model that I would have predicted. It feels like this kind of hydraulic model, which felt to be very 19th century, as opposed to a computational model, which would have had the properties that Fiery was talking about, which is, okay, what's the demon in there that says, okay, how do I figure out if I should be doing my paper or eating ice cream, and then some kind of process where these two different sorts of systems fight against each other, and then one wins, and then some kind of behavior pops out. And I thought, if this is right, then I got to step back about what I thought I knew about the way the mind works. So it was pretty important to me in that respect. I also think it's an important issue. How do we make these decisions about exerting willpower? Because lots of decisions that are really bad in the long run for people, can be understood in this context. So I looked at the literature, and one of the first things I did, as I think many of us around this table would do, would be I planned an empirical agenda, the first part of which was to replicate the finding. And so I had a first-year graduate student who was just starting, and so of course I did what, again, all of us would do, was I made him do all the work. So he put together a replication of one of the big kind of bedrocks of this literature. So in this literature, there's 2 different tasks. So I'm looking this way, and I'm not supposed to look at some words on the screen over here, and this is supposed to drain my willpower because it's hard not to look. And then I do a task that takes willpower, solving some unsolvable anagrams, or doing a Stroop task which requires saying the color that some word is in, as opposed to what the word says, which is hard. So we did that, and we ran about 100 subjects, and we got nothing. We couldn't get the effect. So we contacted the people who developed these stimuli. We also read the literature more carefully, because of course we didn't read it that carefully to begin with, and we specifically went through and we tried to find where the big effect sizes were. So maybe we just picked a weak one. We ran that with their guidance, including their original stimuli, couldn't get it. We ran a 3rd round, and by this time it was the end of the student's first year, because of course these things take time, and he had to write a paper up from his first year project to get to punch his ticket to get to the 2nd year. We couldn't get that one either. So then, as all of us do, again, I started just talking informally with colleagues about this. So I would go to give talks in places, and lo and behold, it turns out there's this kind of background radiation. There's the dark matter of psychology, which is a few people who fail to replicate and don't publish the work, and also don't talk about it because the fact that you failed to replicate has a reputational effect, right? So the person who's in charge of this literature says, oh, these guys were going after me. And so maybe you don't talk about it in polite company, right? It's sort of like sex. It's the thing that we're all doing, we're all replicating, but you just don't want to talk about it too much, right? And once I did that, I started getting the sense that probably I was fishing in a literature where there's no there. And there's other things that I won't discuss that lead me to that conclusion too. I will say one piece of it, which is that more and more work is coming out that's very difficult to interpret under the willpower model. So Carol Dweck has this stuff that says it only works if you have this belief that willpower is a limited resource. And that seems like it's pretty bad for the model. Just a couple days ago, so before I came out here, there was a piece that came out in Psych Science, obviously a prominent place where we'd all like to see our stuff. I'm just going to read the title to you. Heightened sensitivity to temperature cues in individuals with high anxious attachment. That's not important. What's important is what comes after the colon. Real or elusive phenomenon. What I love there, and it was a failure to replicate. So basically there was this effect, which does not matter for this conversation. They just they tried to replicate it. They quadrupled the sample size. They can't get it. And then they published this, and what they published is that it's either real or elusive, right? You can't even say out loud real or kind of wasn't there to begin with, right? These are not things that we say in polite company. And what I want to talk about today, or what I've already talked about and what I want your ideas on is how do we get rid of bad ideas? Because my experience is a little bit like the pessimism that you see in Max Planck, which is that it happens a funeral at a time. And I'm confident we can do better than that. And people discuss this. I should also just kind of as an addendum on the willpower stuff, which is really where, in terms of the content, where my interest is. One of the things that was striking to me is I went back, and so what these authors are saying is that the sort of the substrate of willpower is brain glucose. If you run out of sugar in your head, then you can't exert your self-control. And I did two things. So the first thing I did after I read that is I just did a back-of-the-envelope computation about how much sugar we're talking about. The theory's off by 2 orders of magnitude, right? They're giving people 100 calories of lemonade in these manipulations, and in fact, your whole brain is using like a quarter of a calorie per minute. So you've just used this massive sledgehammer to talk about this little bitty effect. And the other thing I did is I reanalyzed some of the data in the paper on which many of these claims were based. And it turns out that first of all, I should also say, the key data set I asked for, I was told that the data were corrupted. This is a paper that was 2 years old. So already there's something funny going on in our discipline when we can't get the raw data from scholars. But then I looked at the data they did give me, and rather than supporting their claims, it undermined it. So if you just run the math, which wasn't too hard, it was 5 minus 3. That joke is lost without fiery. It turns out that their own data undermine this idea. I want to emphasize again, this is work that's continuing to be excited. I just did a Google search on it before I got here. I just searched, I was organized by time. Within the last month, another dozen papers have come out on this. And I think it's going to turn out that this is not true. It's not true in an important way in the sense that, okay, Obama is not making policy decisions. He's not deciding on whether or not he's going to bomb Libya based on how much glucose he's got in his head or something like that. But he's aware of it. And so this is penetrating into policy sectors. And my point is not specifically narrowly on the willpower stuff, although I think it's important we clean this up. This also has public health stuff. There's this great advertisement back we found in 1971. I say we, this is work in collaboration with my good friend and colleague Angela Duckworth and Joe Cable, a behavioral economist, a neuroeconomist. We found an advertisement which basically says if you want to lose weight, what you do is eat an ice cream cone, because that's got the sugar, right? And so that's going to give you the willpower not to keep eating. And this is something that people, as in my casual conversations, if you're a consumer of psychology as opposed to a producer of psychology, this is the kind of stuff which has penetrated into the popular consciousness. If I just eat a couple of simple carbohydrates, then I'll lose weight. Not going to turn out to be right. Okay. So we have this, I think, responsibility to do better as scholars, particularly as scholars whose work is consumed by the world. Yuri Simonson, my colleague at the University of Pennsylvania in the Wharton School, has written, I think, extremely well on this. He's discussed all the things, again, like sex, that we all do but don't talk about, right? So he calls it p-hacking, where we run enough subjects and then p-value sneaks below 0.05, and then we've decided we're done. That's just one of a large number of things that people do, including selective reporting of dependent measures. I'm not saying people have not addressed this. I understand that people have. I'm saying, in many ways, the replication crisis in psychology is a little bit like the weather, right? So we all talk about it, but no one really does anything about it. We do a little about it here and there, and I'm going to kind of wrap up. I'm going to keep things slow. I'm in that speaker slot who is between the audience and their food, so I'll keep this brief. But I really do feel like this is a good opportunity for us to talk about. I think it's really important. I just want to talk about, again, getting back to me, a couple things that I've done. So I have a journal, Evolution of Human Behavior. As of January of this year, mostly influenced by things like this and Yuri Simonson, we implemented a policy that says you have to post your raw data, all your raw data. Now the exception is if there are a couple of exceptions, right? So if there's identifying stuff in there that violates some kind of HIPAA requirement, privacy requirements. Also, if your data are drawn from a publicly available source, right? So that's already available. And we've had good compliance. So at my journal, I don't want people to run into the problem where they publish this result and then people who are trying to recreate the statistics can't do it. That's the first thing we've done. The second thing we've done is we've got a professional statistician on board. All of our action editors know that if there's anything about the stats that feels dicey to them, they can ask this person to take a look just the stats. So this is a person who doesn't have to worry about the content, the theory, what have you, and is more or less indifferent. He's not even in my discipline. He doesn't really care. He's actually kind of a critic of the discipline, which is one of the reasons I feel lucky to have him. And so just the stats can be looked at by a professional. I think this is a nice innovation which I would love to see elsewhere. Another thing we're talking about is, this seems like it's a separate issue, but I don't think it is. I don't know how many, I bet all of you have looked at people that cite your work and you look at the sentence, you just look at it and you're like, I didn't say that. How did the person take me to be saying that? Even the reverse in some cases. And, having published in law reviews, one of the things I thought was so interesting about their model, and I see why it's difficult to implement, but on the other hand, I don't think it's impossible. They're law students. They go through every single footnote and make sure the source says what you say it says. And now they err on the other direction. So I got this funny comment from a law student who says, what's your citation for the claim that correlation coefficients go between +1 and -1? So fine, they've gone a little bit too far, right? But nonetheless, I think this is, if we think that science is accretive, to the extent that people are misciting these sources and they don't go back and the thing doesn't say what it says, first of all, that means the author was probably confused or lazy, and we should clean that up. But the second thing is, we're not really building an edifice anymore. We're doing this weird smorgasbord kind of thing. So one of the things I'm looking into, I should just say, Evolutionary Behavior is published by Elsevier. The downside of this is they're big and evil, right? Everyone hates Elsevier because they're making a ton of money off of our labor. I take that point. One of the good points is we get the royalties, right? So we get a fraction of that. So we have the resources to have graduate students, go in and check these citations. And as far as I know, in psychology and economics, I think this is true. Philosophy, I think this is true. Not only doesn't this happen, it wouldn't really occur to people, right? The onus is on the author. I don't see any reason why these institutions need to stay in place. So my point here is not yet another, hand-wringing, how horrible is this? Is that we need concrete proposals to move the field forward in a way that's going to be productive. I'm optimistic about psychology. I think that, in 10 years it could be that in addition to a council of economic advisors, as a council of psychological advisors, you're already seeing this a little bit, right? As people who talk about nudges are getting into policy positions. What that means is our powder better be dry. Like, we better be giving ideas to policymakers that are right. And the way to do that, I think, is to do better science. To take it back to where I started, I'll be honest, I think the idea that there is a reservoir of willpower, I think that's just obviously wrong. I think if you look at it in the context of what we already know about the way the mind works, it wouldn't have passed the 10-second test, but it's a very appealing idea. It has a certain resonance. And I'm willing to say that I think as an empirical matter, when people start going into this and try to replicate it, and they bring together all the replications with the existing data, they're going to find there was no there. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that turns out not to be true. And we can talk about that if you want. But I do think that it's going to turn out that there's lots of ideas that people like us, not us obviously, we're too careful for that. And in fact, Yuri Simonson uses Danny Kahneman as an example when he talks about what should your curve look like in terms of p-values, right? It shouldn't look, all of them shouldn't be between 0.045 and 0.05. It should actually look like a lot of them are really small and then a few of them are a little bit bigger. And Danny's curve looks just like that, which means that it's being drawn from the right distribution. That is, he's looking at actual effects and doing appropriate statistics on them. But I think that many of our colleagues are not. And I think that this is the kind of community that has a responsibility to be more assertive about making positive changes so that we do a better job of doing our jobs. Thanks.
Thank you.
John, do you want to call on people?
I think this is a wonderful initiative, and I'm so happy to see someone not sort of, like you're saying, sort of wallowing in this sort of despair that we see ourselves in, but sort of proactively thinking of steps you can take. And a couple of questions I had related to this is, How do you think we can expand this kind of approach towards data sets that are much more complicated to grapple with? So, for example, there's issues that often arise in behavioral coding where people worry there's biases within a lab to be coding a behavior in a way that sort of supports their hypotheses. Do you have people submit, the videotapes? This is just an issue to think about how we expand it. Or data sets that are far more complex and require a lot of pre-processing. I'm thinking neuroimaging, even psychophysiology to this extent. What do we do to really ensure the integrity of the data we get in those, raw data files,
Yeah.
SPSS, Excel? How can we really trace it back to some of the biases that really could be problematic earlier on upstream?
Okay, so let me say two things about that. So the first thing I would say is that the solutions for cleaning things up are going to turn out to be specific to the area. And that's something that's a challenge. I take that point. And so the short answer to your question is I don't know. But let me say something that I think is really important, which is journal incentives. If I did the kind of thing for my authors where I said to them, if you're going to give me a behavioral coding experiment, I need you to send the data to another lab and have them verify it. We're going to look at it. I would stop getting submissions, right? So we've got, I'm not saying this is an easy problem. As an editor, right, to the extent I make my authors' lives harder, which is going to improve the science, I'm going to look worse because down the road, I'm going to get worse papers and they're going to not be cited as often. So, there's no doubt that my incentives have something to do with keeping things either easy for my authors, which is going to push down the quality of the work. And I think that's part of what we've got to start talking about. I mean, already there are some suggestions along these lines.
Yeah.
What about issues of code? You talked about the data you get from your experiments, but a lot of researchers have proprietary code.
Yeah.
Some of it corporately financed, where there are patent issues.
Yeah.
Unless you have the code for the software, you don't have anything.
Yeah.
And yet, often that never comes up. Victoria Stoughton has done a lot of research on this. And how do you handle that?
Yeah. So again, my answer to that is I'm going to go ahead and punt and say that's a great question for the smart people at the table to figure out. I will say this, in my world, code is usually agent-based simulations. And Rob Boyd has introduced what I think is actually crazy that we didn't do before, which is that he has two different people simultaneously do the agent-based simulation code to make sure that when they look at the output, they're not looking at something idiosyncratic because someone made a mistake. They want to make sure they have two replicants of the building of the code. And this, I think, it's a no-brainer. Yes, it adds, again, there's an incentive problem here, which is now he's going to get half as much stuff done because half the time he's doing his buddy's coding. And so that's the kind of innovation that I think has been very good. In terms of what you're talking about, I have to throw up my hands. I don't think these things are insoluble. There might be legal mechanisms that allow people to verify these things. This is, again, one of the nice things about, people don't talk about this. They talk about how horrible it is that Elsevier takes our labor, but it makes pools of money available. So one of the ways that we can deploy resources might be there's various ways you can incentivize people to behave in a better way, or at least to check and verify. Yeah, Danny.
Remarks. One, I don't want to defend the reservoir of willpower, but I think there is a difference between the way that people operate when they're tired and when they're not tired.
No argument.
And so my understanding of Baumeister's research is that he's studying fatigue. And that looks more plausible than, the glucose. I mean, I've read you. On the other point of practices, I have a suggestion, an observation and a suggestion. There is a line of research where Baumeister's and the priming stuff fall into that, where it takes an hour to collect one data point, basically. And those are between subject experiments, and they're expensive, they're very costly, and the samples that people run are too small. They're too small they're too small, I think a reasonable idea, by about a factor of 4, and they haven't increased in the last 50 years. I mean, so there were complaints about that, Jacob Cohen in the 1960s, and it's been replicated by Gabe Renzer 15 or 20 years ago, and nothing is changing. I think that's a matter for editors, and Bobby Spellman and I have been thinking of writing a piece where editors of psychology journals would treat the problem as car makers do with respect to fleet gas mileage. That is, that within 10 years we have the goal of achieving that level of power. And that is agreed across all journals so that you don't get competition with the wrong incentives. And it's slow, but if you have that as an objective and you can measure the average power of those studies against small effects in a reliable and consistent way across time and show improvement, that would, I think, reduce the problem very significantly.
Okay, let me address both. The first one very quickly. I'm not denying the empirical phenomenon. There's definitely something going on. I'm arguing with the explanation. I mean, Bobby's done great things with perspective, and I think exactly what you're talking about is the kind of thing which I want to point to, which is we've got to get groups of editors in fields together, either physically or, in terms of the correspondence or in terms of policy. I think that kind of initiative, that's going to wind up being successful, and this speaks to the question of incentives. Because if I'm no longer competing with editors who are willing to go low in terms of power, now it's an equal playing field, right? This is like hockey helmets. I don't mind if there's a rule that says everyone's got to wear a hockey helmet, but there's no rule I don't want to wear one because I'm going to lose that advantage, right? So it's that I think is where we've got to go, and in order to do that, you've got to have leaders who step forward and say, I'm going to gather these editors, and I'm going to say, you guys, you can do better. And as long as you're not mutually affecting others in a negative way. That's exactly the kind of thing I'm pointing to. Yeah, Seung-Tai.
I wanted to talk about, so it's not helpful in the sense of I'm not proposing a magical solution or even a non-magical solution, but I just want to talk about a little bit what the problem is. That is, I think it's easy to sit and say the problem is replication. It's part of it, but I actually think there are two problems that are actually unrelated to replication, or at least only weakly related to replication, that contribute to the problem. And this is coming from looking, economics has this issue as well. And so let me start with the first one. You mentioned that the title of the paper was Real or Elusive. There's something to that, and here's what I mean. It seems to me a very crude way of describing psychology is that you have quite a bit of control in the lab over the nature of the context you're using to show the effect. So what I mean by that is, even take the original willpower studies. You had said you tried to replicate, you tried to follow their exact methods, and suppose it was turned out that it wasn't, the hand press, but you had just used some other thing and you didn't find it, but you went and did hand press and you found it. Oh, good, they were right. But were they right? Then after all, if I replace hand press with this other thing, but in some narrow sense, and that's what I mean by replication, is I think there's a question of, if you literally replicated the original studies and found they worked perfectly, but if you replaced hand press with some other proxy for self-control and found it no longer worked, that's a different kind of failure to replicate. It's almost like a context sensitivity. And I think that the reason I'm emphasizing that is, I feel like there is quite a bit of that goes on, which has nothing to do with p-hacking, it has to do with, I would like to show this effect. Let me try it with these type of things. Well, it's not. Let me try it with this. And to the extent that that's in the DNA of the field, to say I'm looking for contexts in which certain things happen, then I feel like this type of problem is going to be immense. So let's contrast it with areas where we're trying to find psychological effects, but where everything is very already pre-specified, line up versus show up, or how do we show data that, so then it's really clear, are you picking the right guy, are you doing this, we're looking for effects. There's just a lot less freedom, and replication is much more robust and sensible. Does that make sense? And it feels to me this is as much a problem of what the goal is as it is about the method. I don't know if I'm being clear, but it's that you can really see that, like take biology, where we're all trying to study this cell and this mechanism, then it's very clear when there's a failure. And I feel like the fields where I've seen this happen the biggest is the subfields within psychology, where, like, the willpower is a terrific example. It's a very abstract, big concept. And if I happen to show the effect using hand press, I've shown it. And I'm only pointing this out because you were talking about the Council of Psychological Advisors. I think I would be exactly as concerned if you told me all of these willpower studies perfectly replicated, but they only hold for hand press. What on earth does that have to say anything about policy? So there's a different kind of replication that it feels like psychology needs to take far more seriously, which has to do with robustness across the thing. And then there are areas where it's taken very seriously, and there are areas where it feels like it's just left to something else. Is that?
Sendil, that's one of the major problems, actually. Conceptual replication is what social psychologists do. That is, they go across context. And that is one of the major forms of p-hacking. That is, that there are no constraints on, how many failures to replicate, how Tashra speaks about, when has anybody reported a failure of a conceptual replication? That's absurd. So p-hacking is mediated in large part by conceptual replication.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. So I just think it's a different form of p-hacking. But another way to think about this is, our models. I mean, again, having one foot in economics, one foot in psychology. It's just a different. The entities in our explanations in psychology tend to be way wigglier than one finds in at least some areas of economics, and it leads to these kinds of problems. So it's the nature of the explanations, and then it's some of these methodological practices which are permitted. So I don't think I disagree with.
I think the reason I'm pushing is I don't think that I understand it's used as p-hacking, but it's actually
No, I mean,
statistically totally different.
you're right. It's been misused in a big way. I mean, this is right at the core of the debate between social psychology and its critics, in that social psychologists say we replicate conceptually all the time, and therefore a failure of literal replication doesn't concern us. And that's a big part of the debate.
But I think you said you had 2 points. What was?
I mean, the other point, is this, look, to be honest, economics is as prone to this as psychology, and I think it's terrible. When I've looked at a lot at medicine and how the ideas in medicine have evolved, and here's a striking fact. There are a lot of weird theories that just crazy. The germ theory is crazy. So you're telling me that there are these invisible things into us. Ooh, yeah. And yet, at the same time, here's the anomaly, is that there are these 100 crazy sounding theories, and one of them turns out to be right. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is that, in contrast, when we work in these fields that have these problems, we're so driven by our intuition about what's right. Oh, that sounds wrong. That just feels like it can't be true. But I don't know if you've noticed this, but there's a fundamental dominance given to the theory and the intuition, as opposed to, it's a mess, it's too bad, but the data suggests this, and who knows what it's going to be saying. And even the structure of a psych paper or an economics paper is of the variety. It's like you're forcing your hand into saying, write down the theory, here's a test. Yet you look at biology, a vibrant field, it's a mess. And it's that mess from which stuff arises. And I feel like there's something else, forgetting replication, forgetting everything. Why is there no space for empirical exercises where you say, I don't know what this is, I hope in 50 years we figure it out. I mean, that would be the worst. You would say, what a unintellectual researcher, and they just aren't thinking, they're not. I think that's the other fundamental problem, is that we're not allowing empirics to have its own vibrancy and strength and structure.
Can I just jump in and say, we were just talking about this, and I think that you're confusing the way that we write up our... Yeah. Psychology is a mess, and it is driven a lot by this sort of empiricism that you're describing. And we do lots of studies, and we discover that an effect that we never would have predicted, and then we write up the paper by saying, we saw 3 tests of the hypothesis. And so maybe the error here is in the way that we communicate what we do, but that's never how we do it.
Oh, so but that is what I mean, because I think that is not just an error in communication. All that stuff that you did to arrive at the thing, that's what should be on the other side of the thing.
Absolutely.
In other words, that's...
Absolutely. Yeah. I just wanted to point that it is a mess.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question?
Yeah, Josh.
I feel like so far a lot of our discussion has been about ways that we can avoid making errors in the first place. But it seems like a really central question is, if we have made an error, so we said something that's wrong, how can we make it the case that we will recover from that error? And it seems like if we work backward in the way that Seung-Tai was suggesting earlier, what we would want to have is that the person who initially made the error would change his or her mind, would say, oh, now that there's new data on the table, I guess I was wrong. But then if we work backward from that and we think, what can we do to make people actually change their mind? It seems like a really central thing is kind of something cultural that I feel like right now there's a kind of spirit in our discipline where if someone says something, and then other researchers investigate it further, and it turns out that they're wrong, that they've been somehow bested, they've failed, they've been crushed by this other person who was smarter. If we, culturally, could eliminate that kind of feeling about what happens when you turn out to be wrong, then people would be much more willing to say
Yeah.
that they're wrong. So maybe if we all kind of had a different sort of feeling about what happens when people just say, oh, I guess it wasn't true, people would be much more likely to do it because they recover from errors. So I was thinking maybe like we have the Nobel Prize, maybe we could also have the Nobel Prize. And the Nobel Prize, we go to that person each year who most publicly admitted
Yeah.
that someone else had done an experiment, which is
Yeah.
just refuted him.
That's a great idea. Yeah.
Then the field can just move on. Now that idea, it seemed like a good idea at the time. It's over. No, we're just
What's the name of that prize?
Noble.
The Nobel Prize.
The Nobel Prize.
KNO.
No.
Yeah, I think that's right. So you want to give people, and so scientists are supposed to be the sorts of people who just admit they're wrong. I always remember that nice Arrow quote where, someone asked him why he seems to change his mind in print so often. He says, I don't know if this is true or not, but he says, yeah, that's what I do when I realize I'm wrong. What do you do? And I think that's a good important, right? So the rhetorical questions there. It's just I don't want to name names, but so in this literature, I actually asked someone in this literature. I said, well, there's a stuff out there. What pattern of data would cause you to change your mind? And the reply I got was, you know what? I should really think about that sometime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On that
Yeah.